vision that I think a lot of us share, that ECEC is for all children and all families. It should be. That it's a public good, not a commodity. That it's a shared responsibility between governments and a private responsibility for families, but that governments have to carry the can and make sure that it happens for families. And we see it as a fundamental and necessary and valued part of our social infrastructure, which it is not now, but that is the vision. Now, if you think about the building blocks of an ECEC system, which is what our vision is that it would be a system, there would be certain components to this system. And one of them is a national policy framework. And if you think about Medicare, Medicare has a national policy framework. It has principles, it has ways of operating across the country, even though it's varied across the country. Part of the system is long-term sustained funding, which is another thing that we're lacking, that the funding isn't just sporadic, that it comes down in a budget, that it's a system and that it's built into the apparatus of the Department of Finance, and that it would come down to the provinces and territories and therefore to programs. And another important system component that we see is that in Canada as a federation, there would have to be collaborative system building between the provinces with the federal government taking some leadership, and that would be things like research and data, which is really lacking, looking at innovative programs, how things would move ahead, developing guidelines like things like a national quality framework. That's what when we're talking about collaborative system building, that's what we're talking about. If you look at the little picture at the bottom, this is the way the people who did the video viewed our kind of system, which is there's a national policy framework that's kind of the foundation. I don't know if you can see it, and that there are common services, across the country based on the national policy framework. We see it as having a multi-layered approach so that there would be federal leadership with funding and a broad policy framework. Of course, this is within provincial territorial jurisdiction, so the provinces and territories obviously have to play a key role, and it would have to be worked back and forth and negotiated. And we would also see that Indigenous communities would have a role in determining their services, and so they would be in there with the provinces and territories. And that they would be responsible, and I think this is important from the perspective of Ontario, for developing a robust service system with some of those same components, with the policy framework and so on. Many of us, I particularly, see the role of local government management. In Ontario, we have this in the role of the municipalities, which they don't use in the rest of Canada. Ontario is the only province where the municipalities have the kind of role that they have here. I'm a big fan of local management because it's closer to the population. And in that, we would see including roles for educators and parents so that it would be participatory, so that it's not just top down. Now, just moving on to the state of what we have now. So this is, again, the artist's conception of what we have, which is a patchwork quilt. And if you actually look at the video, you see that there are different pieces of the patchwork, which are the things that we talk about in the patchwork. So we have our limited options. We have most families using unregulated childcare because that's all they can get, and that's all they can find. Maybe some of them want to use it, but generally that is the childcare for most families. We see that the workforce, how many people here are early childhood educators? Yeah. So you know that the workforce is undervalued and underpaid and under everything. Parents are paying sky-high fees that they can't afford in almost all of Canada, except for Quebec. The quality is very uneven, and I can say, because I actually look at childcare across Canada, that Ontario does have a reasonable amount of good childcare compared to some of the other provinces where very often there's almost none. So it depends on the regulations, who's operating it, what the nature of the training is like, but it's very uneven in quality, and our research shows that. And we see that care and education is really still separated. When I'm saying education here, I mean education in the school system, like kindergarten and junior kindergarten, are still quite separate from childcare in any number of ways, which we could go into. And then there are some groups which are especially excluded and cannot get services, and that would be indigenous communities, rural communities in particular, people who work non-standard hours, children with disabilities, and infants, and very often toddlers. It's very hard to get services and pay for services for some well, for everybody, but for some more than others. Talking about what we have now doesn't work, and why doesn't it work? One of the main reasons is that we have very weak public policy. So at the federal level, we have no policy. We do not have any kind of a national, unless you think that income splitting and the universal child care benefit are a child care policy, we don't have a national child care policy at all. We're one of the few OECD countries that has nothing at all as in terms of a national child care policy. Even Australia and the US actually have a lot more than we do. I would say that the provinces and territories all have relatively weak policy. So none of them have really set out a real policy framework with principles and goals and all those kinds of things that really follows through. And that would include Quebec in my estimation. We have very limited public funding, so the OECD data, which is old, our data in the OECD database is incomplete, so I tend to use the older data, which goes back to 2006. Our data is very poor. We, at that time, were spending 0.25% of our GDP on regulated childcare and kindergarten together, and we were at the very bottom of the spending of the OECD countries. And that is about a quarter of the minimum recommended spending for a country, is what we're spending. And the other thing that means that the other piece of it that is very important, contributes to very much to why it doesn't work, is that it's a market, not a system. What does this mean? It means that childcare is basically a commodity. It's purchased, the parents are consumers, and this is true whether it's profit or nonprofit. It operates on a market basis. A childcare center has to break even. And essentially, that makes it into a market, so it's very different from kindergarten, which is part of a system. It's paid for as part of the education system. We have very limited public funds, and most of our public funding for childcare funds the parent, not the programs. And I'm sure you've heard of base funding, wage grants would be part of base funding, but that's quite limited in most of Canada. Again, outside of Quebec and a few of the other provinces who have moved a little bit in that direction. And I think one of the main things about it being a market is that it's primarily a private responsibility. And if you think about it this way, who puts a child care center there? It's either a little group of parents get together, as I did a couple of times when my kids were little and started a nonprofit child care center, or an entrepreneur decides to put it there. It's not part of public planning. It is to some extent in Ontario, where the municipalities have a role, but it's not really about where childcare goes. If a new subdivision is being built, there's nobody who says we're going to build childcare into it. And we have a lot of private ownership. That is both profit and nonprofit is private ownership. So it all goes to make up a market. And as a result of those things, Canada internationally ranks very low on financing, on access, and on quality. Okay, so we have an opportunity in 2015. Why is that? Because we're going to have a federal election. The goals of this campaign is basically to win our vision of a national childcare program in the next election. Essentially, that is what we want to do. But the other thing that we really want to do, and I think I said this to a couple of these folks over here, is that we really, really want to build the childcare movement, because most of us are old. And we need young people in the childcare movement, and we're trying to encourage young people from all these different sectors, from the early childhood sector, some of the trade union people, young academics, to join in. We want young researchers to become part of the childcare movement. So these are our messages. One message is, this is urgent. We can't wait another 4 years. That's a lifetime for a toddler and for parents. We think it's possible and affordable to have a national childcare program. We think it shouldn't just be a matter of luck who happens to get childcare because of how much money you have or where you live in Canada or whether you put your name on a waiting list. I don't have to say this again about income splitting and checks. Mostly benefit wealthy families, and they don't do anything about getting good childcare. And we can have the National Child Care Program this year. So what can you do? Well, for starters, you can vote for childcare, get other people to vote for childcare, join the national campaign organizationally or individually. I'm sure there'll be organizations that you can work with locally, and work locally and nationally. So just in closing, I just want to say something about this vision, because we think that the vision is not only about early childhood education and care. It's about how we see Canada. It's like, what kind of Canada do we want to have? Do we want it to be inclusive? Do we want it to be fair and equitable, not greater inequality? Do we want it to be intelligent? Do we want it to be collective, not everyone for himself or herself? But I think what we're going to need is everybody to join in and understand what we're doing and work together. And that's it. Maybe we'll do it this time. Thanks a lot.